Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. Tonight, we're going to talk about this year's theme for National History Day, which is Frontiers in History, and we'll talk about strategies to help your students find a great topic. My name is Wendy Rex Atzat. I am the state coordinator for the National History Day program in Utah. So we do have teachers online with us tonight, and we invite them to participate in the program tonight. Please let me know if you have a question by shouting out. I will not be able to see the chat. And keep yourself muted if you are not speaking. There are opportunities to engage, share, and discuss as we move through the material tonight. If you haven't looked by now at our schedule for professional development, we're offering different sessions now through October. Everything is free. You will receive relicensure points for synchronous online participation and for any in-person sessions that you attend. But we're offering a combination of both to make it simple and easy for you to get the training that you need and that will be beneficial to you. And if you requested a classroom kit, I know that those have just gone out in the mail, so you should be receiving them soon. So why does National History Day use an annual theme every year? You can see here is an example of 6 recent themes, and they're different every year, and they try not to rotate them so that kids ever get the same theme twice. But the reason we have the annual theme is twofold. First of all, it does help kids kind of orient their thinking around a project, and it really gives them a step towards being able to analyze and make an argument, because they can use these theme ideas as a lens to think a little bit harder about the research and the topic that they're working on. So every year we have a different theme, but they all work kind of the same way. Oh no, I hope this doesn't kick me off. They all work the same way, which is they usually involve 1 or 2 or 3 concepts, and students can look for the way that the concept applies to their topic. The key to all of this is keeping student interest in the forefront. And so we don't use the theme to narrow down student choice. We want students to find a topic that is a good fit for this theme, but is also something that's going to be really interesting and engaging to them, so it keeps them interested in their project. Our theme this year is Frontiers in History, People, Places, and Ideas. So let's have a bit of a brainstorm. I would invite you all to unmute and let's talk about what is a frontier. Let's define this term. The mic is open. What does it mean? What do we mean by a frontier when we say a frontier?
Something new, something that's changes, something that is different. Could be a boundary, it could be an idea, could be a change in thought.
Great. I like all of those ways of thinking about frontier. Anybody else?
When I think frontier, I think explore.
Okay. Which relates really well to that concept of something that's new, something that because you're exploring something that's new or different.
Sorry, I'm in a loud place, but I was thinking of something on the edge or that pushed the boundary, because the frontier is usually the edge of where the society is. So something that was kind of pushing that boundary.
Right. It does have a lot to do with a boundary and crossing over a boundary, right? Other ideas? What do you think when you do this brainstorm with your class? What are your students going to say?
I think they're going to think of pioneers and stuff because we study 4th grade history, but I'm going to have to kind of push them into innovation and thinking of who, creative thinking, and I'm going to have to push that a little further.
Yes. I think that you are right. I think that the trick here is going to be to quickly move beyond like stereotypical images of pioneers and wagons, right? And moving kids right past that to think a little more deeply about all the different ways they can find frontiers in history that are going to be interesting and engaging to them. Okay, so we've developed some definitions, and this is consistent with the materials that the national office is also providing. So what is a frontier and how can it involve peoples, places, or ideas? And as we talked about, a frontier is the area around some kind of border or a limit. And that can be a limit of knowledge or understanding what is known, right? Or it can be a region between peoples or nations or empires. So let's start with this concept of moving beyond the limits of what is currently known and developing new ideas, new technologies, new knowledge. We feel like a good keyword for this kind of frontier is innovation. And so this is where the frontier involves ideas and change and pushing beyond what's known to something new, but it does exist in kind of this realm of ideas and technologies and knowledge. And so there are key questions to get your students thinking about if they are going to look into innovation and ideas. What is new about this thing? What's new about the idea? How is it different from what came before? What's creative about it? Right? So these are all different ways to get them thinking about what's new about this. How is it different? There needs to be a shift or a change for it to be an innovation. And then helping them connect the innovation that they are going to look at to people. Who was the creator? What was the purpose of the innovation? Was there one creator? Was it done by a team? Did many people contribute to the idea as it changed over time? Who supported the innovation and who opposed it? And why? Why were there supporters and why were there oppositions? This helps them get at multiple perspectives. And then who benefited from this? Who benefited and did it have negative impacts for other people? Right? Whoops, sorry. Any questions about thinking about this in terms of history of science for a minute? Because I know that when we have history of science topics, kids sometimes struggle to look at multiple perspectives, right? And it's hard for them to see sometimes maybe if certain people supported or benefited and then other people opposed or suffered because of the technology. A nice way to think about this, I think, is atomic weapons, right? I mean, that's a case study or an example that you could talk about that really does show all of these complexities that can surround history of science and technologies, right? You can talk about why the United States invested so heavily in developing an atomic weapon in the competition against Nazi Germany during World War II, but also there is very clear opposition from the scientific people in the scientific community. And then there are people who suffered from the outcome of that technology in Japan, right? And so I think that offers you a nice way to just kind of introduce this concept of, yes, history of science topics, you can find multiple perspectives surrounding the development of a technology. Okay. There are so many topic possibilities when we're thinking about ideas and innovation. Or maybe another way you can think about it is breaking a barrier, okay? So shout out for me some Like, let's get 3 really obvious innovation topics out into the discussion, and then let's go into things that are less obvious. Anybody like to contribute something obvious?
Space.
Yes, space is going to be huge this year, which I don't say that to discourage people. I think it's a great theme for kids who are interested in space.
Like the cell phone.
Oh yeah, that's a great idea. Development of the cell phone. Let's see, how old are cell phones? Are they at least 20 years old?
Yes,
I'm aging myself. I can't remember when I got my first cell phone.
I had one in grad school and that was 1996.
Okay. The internet, you know, by extension, would be something that would be interesting for kids, I think. All right, let's get off the beaten track and think about art, music, popular culture, things like that. There's so much innovation that goes on in the arts.
Rap music.
Yes, I think rap would be great.
Even rock and roll music from the 60s.
Yeah. Yes, I think that would be good. And there are so many examples if you look at rock and roll. Any other ideas from like the world of art? I mean, you know, Impressionism. Oh, I have it on the list. There, I thought of it again. So many examples. Go ahead.
I have students that are really getting into like the frontier of anime. Like they're creating their own characters on their folders and stuff. And we link that in with cultural change, and cultural change itself is a frontier because it's always something that's changing and that we explore, if that's something that's a little less obvious.
I think that's a great idea. I love, you know, if you have students who can analyze popular culture, I think it's really illuminating for them to do those kinds of topics. And they're so interesting. Especially if you put them, you know, when you place them into their kind of cultural and historical contexts, which they would need to do. All right. Okay, let's move on and we'll talk about the other kinds of frontier. And we're calling these the places and peoples frontiers. I wanted to get a little bit away from this idea of a line on a map, because a frontier is more like a zone of interaction when you think about it as a geography that changes, right? As people move, as power shifts in an area. Like when we think about the American frontier, that is limited to a certain place and time, right? But if you think about it more broadly, like it originally meant a border region between countries in Europe, and then it took on all these additional associations as it became very caught up in American history and American expansion, and how those processes have been understood to be kind of developmental in the United States. But we can see these kinds of border regions happening all over the world. And they don't necessarily only happen between nation states or between empires, but can happen, you know, where different cultures are meeting and intermingling. So pay attention if you have students who really find that they must work on this kind of frontier. They need to pay very close attention to who is in power and how power is shifting and changing, who is in control in the region. And then, but also always making sure that they are addressing multiple perspectives in that place and time, and including the people who were already in the region, In the American West, that's going to be certain Native American tribes that are relevant to the location they're studying, as well as Latinos in the Southwest and moving up into Utah. And not just the people who are coming in to the region from Europe, from the Americas, or from the American states, okay? So if they are going to do this kind of a frontier, it's really important that they take on that multiple perspectives and talk about not just the place, but also the peoples who were there. So I think too that you will need to spend some time helping students think about some of the meaning behind the words that are commonly used to think about the American frontier, and think critically about them, like this idea of a pioneer. What is a pioneer? Can anybody be a pioneer? Why could you, what limits who can be a pioneer? Is it an open category or isn't? Same kind of questions for civilization. What do we even mean by civilization? Do all people have it? Is that a definition that has changed over time? What's the opposite of civilization? Wilderness. Is wilderness something that is real and that really doesn't have people living in it? Like, questioning a lot of the assumptions that are attached to these words is going to be really important. And then encouraging students to be very specific about the peoples that are living in the frontier, identifying who they are, their cultures, languages, nationalities, what their goals are, whether there is cooperation or conflict among them, and why that's happening. All right. So there's a lot to unpack with this idea of the Western frontier. And this is where it kind of gets fun, particularly if you're working with older students. It's really important to spend some time disentangling history from the myths and stereotypes that have grown up around that history. So here are some examples of some common stereotypes surrounding the American frontier or the American West. So we have the sheriff, the lone cowboy, we have the family in the covered wagon, a real domestic ideal in the Laura Ingalls Wilder books. We have Hollywood film that deals with that intercultural conflict. And all of these are examples of pieces of popular culture that both express and also reinforce a lot of stereotypes that have arisen around these concepts of pioneering and the frontier. So one concept that's important for students to understand when you're talking about this is manifest destiny. And you can talk about this phrase, which was coined in 1845. And I'm sure that most of you already work with this material in your classes. It's pretty common material around manifest destiny, and that's kind of why I included it tonight. But looking at this painting from 1872, the title is American Progress. And it is a painting that I think students can analyze really productively to understand not so much the historical context. You have to provide that context for them to be able to interpret this, but what does progress mean in this painting? And how does that relate to an American idea of moving across the continent towards the West? So I'm going to open up the mic again for discussion. Look closely at the painting and let's talk about what you see here. What are the ideas embedded in this piece of art? I apologize, I cannot get the Zoom menu to move any farther. Oops. Okay, anyone? What's this painting saying? What's the message? Go
There
ahead.
are several technologies that they are bringing across the West, such as the train, the steamboat, the covered wagon, plowing. So I just see that a lot of, she's holding, I believe, the Book of Knowledge. So, bringing that across the West. So there are, I just see a lot of technology moving from the East to the West.
And that kind of does tie in with this idea of what progress is. It's technological advancement. She's also carrying telegraph wire.
I've actually looked at this with my 7th grade students when we talk about pioneers moving west into Utah. And they kind of point out that like some of the wild animals, like the buffalo and that, are being chased as they move across. And I've had a lot of them notice that like there's light coming towards the darkness. And they're like, oh, that's because we talk about innovation and change. And it's amazing how much 7th graders notice in these kind of images, right? It's really cool.
Yeah, great. I love that they notice the light. The light is in the east, the darkness is in the west. Other thoughts about this painting?
There are many different groups shown in this. You have the Native Americans, but you also have the mountain men that's walking forward in the front, prospectors, and then, being followed by others, the stagecoach, the wagons behind. So it's not just one group, it's several different groups over time, even though it doesn't show it that way. But it just wasn't all at once. It was over decades that this took place till there's no more left.
I like that you notice that this painting reads a little bit like a timeline, right? Where you notice the mountain man, the frontiersman down at the front of the line on the base of the painting, and then at the back they're followed by the farmers, who were followed by the trains. I think that captures a pretty common way of understanding that process of westering. How are Native people portrayed here?
They're portrayed as more uncivilized.
What do we mean by uncivilized?
Well, more savage, not as technologically savvy, not using basically the technologies that the American frontiersmen are using.
So you're right. I think you're picking up very much on this contrast between people that have technology and people that don't have it. Even though, as historians, we know that Native people had a lot of technologies at their disposal.
Right.
Not necessarily metals and weapons and ammunition, but other technologies. So this is a way of portraying these people as inferior, right?
I also see them being as,
Go ahead.
I also see them being as undesirable, unwanted. But I also think it's interesting that they're riding horses and riding them away, and they didn't have the horses till the Europeans brought them in. So, they were destroyed because they didn't have the technology equal to the Europeans, but yet they still benefited from those technologies and wanted those technologies.
Yeah, and actually the horse advanced up into North America well before the settlers did. because they came from the South,
Right.
from the Spanish colonies that were South. And so they did have horses well before settlers started moving west from the United States. But I think your point about the complexities of those interactions and how things that came in from Europe changed Native American lives and ways of living in really crucial ways. That's really important. And it's also, I hope you guys talk about the Colombian Exchange in your classes so that you can also talk about all of the things that went to Europe from the Americas after Columbus, because it's a great way to think not just about kind of one directional change, but about honestly the proliferation of many kinds of changes that sort of spread across the globe. But yeah, so who do we not see in this painting? And I know that this is painted in 1872, and it definitely has a perspective of somebody sitting in the East looking to the West and imagining this as a process. But who do we not see here that ought to be in our images of the American West and the people who were here?
Well, certainly Chinese people, large amounts of Chinese people helped build railroads.
Yeah.
Also, Mexican people that were living in southwestern United States. Well, it was Mexico at the time, but yeah, you get it.
Absolutely. So there's a little bit of America washing going on in this painting, right? There's some denial that Mexico was a large part of Western North America in the early 19th century, and that those people are still there. And even though not many Latino people are coming into Utah in the 19th century, they still were there, and it sort of discounts the whole of the American Southwest, Texas, New Mexico, California, right? And absolutely missing that really significant migration of people and workers from Asia, from China, and then Japan and the Philippines. So yeah, this is very much a limited view, but it's also become sort of the popular and dominant view of the American West and the frontier as a process. And that's why I think it's really important to give kids a chance to start unpacking those ideas and assumptions. Okay. So here's another painting. I really love to use art to help kids begin to analyze. So this is a painting called The Battle of Bear River. It's painted by Edmund Fitzgerald in 1941, and it still is on the wall today in Preston, Idaho, in the post office. And as I'm sure you know, the Bear River Massacre happened very, very close to Preston. So this is another great source for analysis once you've modeled some of these activities and these skills for your students. Let's start with this question. Is this painting a primary source that helps historians and helps us understand what happened at the Bear River Massacre?
No.
Why not?
It was created in 1941, which was obviously quite a long time after the actual massacre.
Mm-hmm. That's right. The massacre was in 1863, I believe. What do you feel like, is this historically accurate? Even if it isn't a primary source, is it a painting that is attempting to be accurate in its portrayal of this event?
Sorry, I'm kind of talking a lot, but Not really, because I'm from that same area as Preston, and the Indian people there did not wear clothing like that, even in battle. It's kind of a cold area. And just, I don't know, there's a lot of stereotypical Native American things that are in this painting that aren't necessarily for that tribe that lived there.
Mhm. And this happened in January. Like, it was cold. Yeah, so I'm glad that you immediately point out the clothing, the absence of winter clothing, but also the very stereotypical kinds of clothing that they are portrayed. What else isn't shown here?
There's no women, there's no children. And
Yeah,
if you know anything about it, they were a large part of this.
right. That's right. That's right. We know through archaeology and through other sources of information, we don't know this very well from the documentary evidence, but we know that more than 400 people were killed, and that included many, many women, children, elderly. So this was an attack on an entire village, not a battle between armed forces of men, like it's shown here. What
That
else
was-
would you, go ahead.
That was going to be my comment. I'm not sure how many of the natives would have had rifles.
So actually, rifles, yes, because there had been an active trade going on in this part of Utah and Idaho, this region. For some decades, the problem was ammunition, because it was much harder to keep supplies of ammunition. And so, yes, rifles, but not a ton of ammunition, and that was one big problem. And so they also were using bows and arrows and other kinds of weapons. And you
To
know,
me-
the army had rolled in a cannon.
To me, the topography, they has it up in the mountains on the river going by. If you know where it took place, they weren't in the mountains, they were out in the middle of the valley.
Mhm. There is a bluff overlooking the river right there, but it's not mountainous. You're right. Okay, so how do you, I have some prompts here, but I think we've hit everything. How do you guide students through this kind of analysis? I mean, this really touches on a lot of stereotypes that are honestly very painful still. Any strategies you have that seem to work really well?
Called a massacre today.
Why is it called a massacre today? And why was it called a battle for so many years? And why has that changed? Go ahead.
One of the things I when I've taught this is, what's the difference between a massacre and a battle? You know, explain the difference. We talk about the Boston Massacre, and we get 5 people killed. You know, and that's a massacre, but this is a battle. And just compare and contrast those two different ideas. Who's the narrator? Who wrote the story?
Right, who's telling the story?
Yeah,
Mhm.
and it just means there's an imbalance of power.
So, sorry. When you asked about strategy of teaching it, we go through it with cause and effect, like what things led up or caused this to happen, and what was the cause or the aftermath of, what was the effect of this event too. So looking at like more than just the event, but before and after.
Much better. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think too,
I've
when
only
you
had to blow
are,
my nose a couple of times today, unlike my students who've still gone through another box.
Laura, are you sharing with the group?
I'm so sorry. I thought I was muted.
I can't, it's okay. I couldn't quite tell. It sounded like you might be, you're having parallel conversations. So I think it's important with an image like this that communicates a lot of messages that, like today, we would recognize as being very harmful, is to place it in its own historical context and think about who is telling the story and what's the story that's important for them to tell in 1941, right? About how they understand the process of conquest or of settlement or of pioneering or of colonization. You know, choose your terms, but this is a narrative that is kind of particular in the way it's trying to portray a history. And then does the adoption by a larger culture of this idea of this event as being a massacre, which has just happened in the last 20 years. I mean, what does that mean? And what does that say about culture today in that region? That it was not just possible to change the way we talk about this event, but that it's been embraced, right? Okay, let's move on. Okay, so if we are going to have students who are going to do Native American history, there are some challenges that they need to know about. And some of them we touched on a little bit in our discussion. But being aware that most of the available primary sources from the time period, and if you use just the Bear River Massacre as an example, that's a good example, they reflect non-Native perspectives. I mean, the Army report, the newspaper reports, you know, local accounts. These are written from a perspective of white people, right? And many of them not even really living near the area. So it's important to look at those primary sources and be very aware of that perspective, because that's going to shape what they read in those sources. They need to be able to identify those biases. A lot of times, primary sources from the 19th century and the early 20th century contain really disrespectful language and ideas about Native people that are just not appropriate for use today. And your students need to be able to recognize that and not just kind of assume that it's okay. And then, as we talked about, and I think you guys were really, really good at unpacking that painting, but the myths and the misunderstandings and the stereotypes are going to shape students' perceptions too, because they are so deeply embedded in so much popular culture that is just kind of in the water, right? And some of these stereotypes are really crucial for kids to recognize and think their way out of. And one of them is that all Native peoples were the same and are the same, and not recognizing the diversity of language and culture and even in tribal political organization, where each band has its own identity. And students will make the mistake of just talking about Native Americans in a very blanket terms, and that's just not appropriate to do. Also, stereotypes that Native peoples were primitive, or that they lacked civilization, that they lacked culture, and that civilization came into the region with Europeans. That's a problematic stereotype. And then another one that's really pernicious, and that I think you can see in the first painting that we looked at, American Progress, is that Native peoples only existed in the past, that their histories ended with settlement and conquest, and that you know, that they are not living parts of our living present. And that's also not true, and it's a very pernicious stereotype. So there are some best practices for doing Native American history. And this includes being very specific about tribal identities, being very clear on exactly who the students are focusing on, who is living in the region. And, you know, understanding that not all clothing was the same, not all housing was the same, not all Native communities in Utah had the horse, right? There's a lot of differences, and those are important. Another best practice is relying on credible secondary sources to build depth of knowledge about Native peoples and histories and cultures, and to find primary sources that provide Native perspectives. This means that you're going to be looking for Native scholars, for oral histories, oral traditions, tribal authors, material that comes from that Native perspective. Being alert and able to identify, and instead of assume and take on and perpetuate myths and misunderstandings, to be able to see them and analyze them for what they are. And then paying attention to different authors and their perspectives in primary and in secondary sources. It's really tricky to do this. So there are some really great resources out there to help students work on Native American history. At a very, very minimum, please make sure that they watch the We Shall Remain videos. Those are available on UEN. They're easy to find, and they're so good, and they're very watchable. There is a terrific educational component at the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian website. It's called Native Knowledge 360 or NK 360. I highly recommend this. It is, and especially their page, their list of FAQs, and also just the resources and the historical context that they offer on that website is really, really good. And it's not dense like a thick book. Going to tribal websites can be helpful. They vary a lot in how much history is on them, but that's an important place for students to go. And then we've just been developing with UEN a new resource hub for American Indian materials or Native American materials. And it's there on your screen at uen.org/American Indian. So you can reach all of those things that I've just mentioned from that hub, as well as a lot more. So students who can do more depth and who are ready for more depth, I would recommend looking at Forrest Kutch's book, A History of Utah's American Indians. I would look at Darren Perry's book if they're going to look at Shoshone history at all. He's got a fairly recent book out on the Bear River Massacre that's very readable. A dense book, but also really well done, is Ned Blackhawk's book, Violence Over the Land. Sandra Jones's recent book, Being and Becoming Ute. And then there are good articles in the Utah Historical Quarterly. So these are all, except for Darren Perry's book, those other ones are going to be more scholarly, denser. And so I just encourage students to not get overwhelmed by a big book, but to be strategic and use the index. And another great strategy is to look on YouTube for lectures or interviews with the authors, where you can get kind of a smaller bite-sized serving of the content that can be helpful. And then another resource that I forgot to add to the slide is the American Indian Digital Archive, which is a project out of the University of Utah and does have primary sources on Utah's Native American histories. Okay, before we move on, any questions about this information? Okay. All right, so let's come back to myths and myth building and popular culture. And I think a great way to look at this is by looking at Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. I think that especially after Hugh Jackman's movie about P.T. Barnum, kids are a lot more likely to understand this idea of somebody who's a showman who kind of builds a reality or creates a persona that is larger than who he actually was. And so you can have some interesting conversations about Buffalo Bill and ask, you know, was Buffalo Bill a real person? Is he the same as William Cody? Is he different? Was he a fictional character? And then you can talk about I don't know if you ever talk about the Wild West show. It's fascinating, endlessly fascinating. It was a traveling circus, traveled all over the US and through Europe for about over 20 years, hugely popular, did a lot of cultural work to shape and reinforce frontier mythology. So you can talk about how it did that. And my question for you is, can you think of an example of something that does this work for the frontier today? Can you think of anything that seems really present that kind of still does this kind of work?
Possibly rodeos. I mean, they kind of carry on that same Wild West show feel.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. A really good connection. And there is authenticity in the experience, and yet it also is, you know, it's feeding into this mythology that gives us this wonderful identity, you know, in the West, right? And it feels great until we start to think about it too hard. Anybody else have any thoughts on this?
I had a student that was telling me that there's like ice roads or something about the Alaskan frontier and truckers that try and, they were telling me about that. And I was like, oh, but I haven't looked into it yet. But it seems like it gives you like the idea or the picture of that frontier that they want you to have. So it'd be a similar scenario.
That's such a great example. And there, honestly, now that you're saying reality TV, reality in air quotes, but right, so there is that show about the folks who live in Alaska. There's also the show about the miners in Alaska. There's the show about the naked survivalists, right, that go all over the world. There's a lot of this going on right now. Yeah. And so I think it's helpful to kind of show that this isn't just something that is kind of 19th century, early 20th century. This all looks so old fashioned, and yet it's still very much alive and present around us. So let's talk a little bit more about kind of guiding students and helping them do that wayfinding through this like really fascinating mixture. It's like a mashup of history and myth, right? And I think the juxtaposition of these two photos says it really well. So we have an image in our collections at the Historical Society of William Cody when he was in Utah, and you can see him leaning up against the hitching post there. And then we have, you know, a studio portrait of Buffalo Bill in his costume with Sitting Bull, taken in Montreal in 1885. And you can see this is very posed, and it is very meaningful. It is laden with meaning. And he is pointing off into the distance. Maybe he's pointing into the future. Maybe he's pointing towards progress. Like, we know that Buffalo Bill's Wild West show used the train to travel around the country, right? And so it's very easy to get kind of distracted by the nostalgia that's embedded in these mythologies and lose sight of the history that's really a big part of them. So does anybody have like thoughts or ideas or things that they like to try with their students when you're talking about things like this?
New to this, but I always ask them whose perspective, who's telling the story, and why do you think they're telling it this way?
Mm-hmm.
So I just think that's a very important thing to have them consider, especially when we're talking about history.
Thank you. I do think that helps add a lot of clarity to things that can probably kind of seem confusing. Anybody else? Okay. Well, I hope that I see at least one project on Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, because I think that would be a terrific topic and so much fun. And just as I said, endlessly fascinating to pick it all apart. All right, let's talk a little bit about helping your students find a great topic that's going to fit this year's theme. And I think, you know, we talked about topic ideas already. I always encourage you to brainstorm with your students and just really open it up. We don't want the theme to limit how they think about what they might work on. Start with where their interests are and move from there. Just be aware that we do, for kids who make it to state, we do offer special prizes that have money attached to them in these basic areas, but that doesn't mean that those are the only kind of fields of history that students can explore. Anything that they are interested in and that they can make a good connection to the theme is what we want them to do. It's really important to help them get from their big ideas to one that is the right size for a History Day project. And so you probably will spend a lot of time helping them narrow down from a broad interest, such as World War II, to something that's very specific. Maybe it's, what's a really good specific topic from the World War II era? I think the Manhattan Project would be a good one, actually narrow enough. And the combination of that interest, the theme ideas, the narrow topic, and really should feed all the way into informing what they eventually argue, because their argument is going to combine the theme and their topic. So that's why the point ends in the thesis statement. So here are some good ideas to help kids get, like, sample a lot of topics, because I know that a lot of students come into this and don't have maybe a well-defined historical interest already, especially if they're younger, just coming out of elementary school or, you know, in middle school. One idea that I absolutely love came from some friends who are librarians, and they like to do book tastings where you ask your librarian to set out lots of books in the library that kids can just kind of go through and sample. They can see the cover, they can really easily surf through them. It's much quicker and more engaging than looking at books on the shelf or just looking at the spine. Using picture books and the notable person books for this works really well. You know, those bobblehead books. Looking at, you know, kind of compilations from organizations like A Mighty Girl can lead kids onto topics that will be interesting to them. And springboarding off of historical things that they're interested in. If there's a book that they've read that they really loved, a movie, or somebody they follow on YouTube, or a podcaster, or honestly video games, any of those can springboard into a good topic that will keep their interest. Heritage connections, also like a really common source of topic ideas. Some of the activities that teachers use in their classrooms are putting up a topic tree where you know, you can put fruit on the tree with lots of different topic ideas that the students put together. Playing I Wonder games. I actually cannot see my third bullet, so we'll have to just assume that it was a great idea. I want to show you the topic list that we've put together for this year. And I want to shout out to Heidi and Tatiana, who put hours and hours into this. And we've gone to this topic idea list because we had so much feedback from teachers saying, my students are stumped when they get to starting the research. And so what we wanted to do is offer not just a list of ideas, but also a few places to start looking into that topic and get them away from Google searches and Wikipedia that way. And so I'll show this to you after I end the slides, but it's robust, it has tons of ideas, and students can use a topic off the list. They can springboard from a topic on the list. They can choose a topic that isn't on the list. The list is just there to be a tool. It's there to be helpful. To set students up for the most success, you want them to find a topic that's going to have plenty of primary and secondary sources. We had a student a long time ago who wanted to do the penguin quilt walk, which was a really cool topic, but just not enough sources available. And it ended up being kind of frustrating for him. Looking for a topic where they will be able to identify and do research on multiple perspectives, something where they can show what happened, what things were like before, and then during, and then after the topic. So it does need to be something that isn't contemporary. Once again, my menu is covering the bottom of my slides. Oh, right. And a topic that avoids landmines, especially with this year's theme, moving them away from those problematic topic choices is going to be helpful, and everybody will sleep a little easier. So we've put together a tip sheet, which I will share with you as well, and then just a basic checklist for students. So they need to be able to identify for you what is the frontier that they are going to be talking about with their topic. Make sure that this is stated clearly in their thesis, and make sure that they make meaningful connections to that frontier through the body of the project. The topics do need to be historical. It's really best to choose something that happened at least 25 years ago. That's why I was asking about the cell phones. If they are choosing, let's see, there are three theme ideas that go with frontiers: people, places, and ideas. They do not need to feel pressed to address all three of those things, but they should address all of the things that are relevant to their topic. And we really feel like most topics, they're going to be able to connect to at least two of those things: ideas and people, places and peoples, and maybe some topics they'll be able to address all three of those things: people, places, and ideas. But we don't want them to forge an unnatural connection. We want them to use those theme concepts to really dig deeply into the topic and to be analytical. All right, and then they need to pay attention to the outcomes. How did the topic change things? What were the short-term impacts? What were the long-term impacts? And were those impacts positive? Were they negative? Were they a mix of both? Did everyone benefit? Probably not. So who didn't benefit? Okay. And then resources to bookmark. I want to make sure that all of you can easily get to the Padlets, which some of you were on, and we did this at the beginning, and then I'll do it again if you want to hang around if you missed it. The NHD theme resources, which is on the nhd.org website. And then also NHD has some great resources around building a more perfect union, around World War I, and around women in American history. All right, I am going to stop sharing for a moment and open it up for any questions that you have lingering, and then people who would like to stay around for a Padlet tour can. And I'll also put up the Frontiers list. Are there questions that you have now that we've been through all of this? Okay, I'm quite sure that I have not answered every single question, but I'll take your word for it. I'm going to quickly hop over and show you the Frontiers topic idea list. Okay, so it is a spreadsheet. It's a Google sheet, and it's designed, it's published to the web, and that's because we want students and you to be able to easily click over because it's full of embedded links. So I'm going to move that, and you'll see our first tab is filled with our definitions. A lot of this is the same stuff that we just went over together. And then, links and resources is another page just filled with incredible resources. that they can link directly to. And then we've got a tab for topics on the American West and Utah history. And we kind of start that page off with myths, stereotypes, and popular culture topics. And we have another tab with US history topics, and then one with world history topics. And you'll see in the Learn More column where we've given them some breadcrumbs to get started on their research in good quality sources on the topic. So you can access this through the student and teacher Padlets. We also, I wanted to show you our tip sheet, which is right here. This is designed to be a one-page handout that you can use in the classroom, and it basically summarizes everything that we spent an hour talking about tonight. Okay. And then I also have the slide deck that I used tonight in the teacher Padlet. You're welcome to download that and modify it for use with your own students. Any other questions that I can answer before we conclude? Okay. Thank you, Kim. I'm glad this was helpful. I want it to be helpful. Please, please reach out as you have questions and as you're going. We're happy to talk things through and happy to work with you during the year. And it was great to see everybody, and welcome to people who are new. Keep in touch. We'll see you soon. Thanks, everybody.